What happened at a crucial point in the development of World War I, as you can remember, is actually two things involving Russia. First of all, Serbia is faced with an ultimatum. Austria-Hungary presents it with an unacceptable thing that essentially would involve giving up Serbian sovereignty. The Serbs say, no, we can't do this. They say, look, we don't want war. We're happy to work with you. We realize something terrible has happened. But on the other hand, we are not going to just give up our national sovereignty because of the actions of one person. Russia comes to Serbia's aid and says, if Serbia is attacked, we will defend Serbia. And so they're a crucial part of this series of dominoes that sets up the entire war. But there's something more important than that. The Tsar gives the order to mobilize at a very early stage because he realizes that it will take at least a month to get Russian troops to the front and prepared to fight. And that is precisely what Austria and Germany especially take as an act of war and then respond to. So Russia plays a vital role. Now, some of the biggest battles early in the war take place on the Eastern Front between the Russians and the Germans, or the Russians and the Austrians. And one of the German and Austrian goals throughout the war is to get Russia out of the war, to win on the Eastern Front so that they can turn full attention to the Western Front, where things were a stalemate, and Germany quite reasonably thought, if only we could take all those armies that are over there fighting the Russians and move them to the Western Front, we'd have a great advantage. So Russia becomes a crucial element to this strategy. Well, at some point, as we'll see, the Germans take some radicals who want to overthrow the Russian government, and they put them on a train and send them to Russia. That turns out to be something crucial that shapes 20th century history in a fundamental way. Let's start with, actually, I don't want to start with that. We already talked about that. But we've talked about some of this vision of what a communist society would be like. Here's how Marx describes it in the German ideology. We've seen this image before, but I want to remind you to start out with. He says, well, yeah, look, in a capitalist society, people have to be tied to one specific social role. That won't be true in a communist society. Basically, everybody can be accomplished in anything they want. So you can do one thing today and another tomorrow, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, as you have a mind. And so the idea is, today I'm a philosophy professor, but tomorrow, gee, I'd like to be a musician, so I can do that. And then I get tired of that, and so I think, well, Wednesday, it'd be cool to be an artist. And then Thursday, maybe I think, well, you know what I'd really like is to do some carpentry, blah, blah, blah. And I can do that, is the idea. Now, as we saw, there's something very strange about this image, which is that actually the essence of humanity, according to Marx, is what? Anybody remember?
What you can make.
Exactly, it's making, it's production. Okay? We are what we do, what we make. And so production is vital to us as human beings, and none of this involves production. These are hunter-gatherer activities that don't involve production. And when you think about production, it's sort of hard, right? Most people don't produce things that take them only a short amount of time. How many people actually produce things where in one day you can go from start to finish and have your product?
An artist.
You think of things like that?
An artist, I guess.
Like you get like a spring of creativity.
Okay, maybe an artist can do that, do a painting in one day. A photographer can do it in a second. Okay. Yes, yes, somebody had to produce the camera. How long do you think it takes to produce a camera? If you had to do it all by yourself, right? That'd be a pretty difficult, in fact, impossible job. So you might think, well, wait a minute, this presupposes a lot of things in the background. And you might also suspect from this that when you actually try to put communism into practice, certain issues are going to arise. Well, they do, and we're going to look at some of those issues. Okay, good. Now, we've talked some about the issues before, so I don't want to go back to that. But what I do want to focus on is a crucial element that gets added to the mix for a variety of reasons, which is violence. Now, first point is World War I did involve violence on an unprecedented scale. We've talked about the numbers of people killed, the percentage of populations killed, ranging from around 4% for France, Germany, Britain, some of the other countries closely involved in the fighting, up to more than 16% of the Serbian population killed. So it involved violence and death on an unprecedented scale. For every person killed, moreover, 3 others were wounded. And so if you think about the total number of casualties, lives seriously affected, in some cases really destroyed without actual death resulting immediately, you realize the devastation here was just immense. Now, in some quarters, that led to a fascination with violence. Some people came back from the war pacifists, horrified by the war, horrified by violence. But other people came back addicted to violence, finding there's something exciting in the idea of violence. Often these were people who weren't actually at the front witnessing it. But in any case, it was a fascination that began before the war. It was a fascination that continued after the war. We're going to talk some about some artistic movements that demonstrate this. As for example, in Futurism, we'll see some examples soon. The founder of Futurism actually founded it in 1909, well before the war. But it really took on, you might say, a life of its own and became more popular after the war. His name was Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. He rejected the past and everything about it. He glorified novelty, danger, violence, speed. And there's something in this idea that becomes gripping to people, and had become gripping even before the war. They get fascinated by the possibility of violence. If you're disaffected, if you're cynical about the way things are, how can you change them? Well, cynicism itself doesn't promote any useful change. You probably knew all sorts of cynical people in high school. Did they do anything useful to promote change? Probably in most cases, no. And so, you might say, well, how do you get beyond the past? You're trapped in this thing, you've lost faith in it, you don't really believe in it, how do you change it? Well, here's one idea. Yeah, we want things that are new. And how do we get those? Well, danger. We embrace danger. We embrace violence. We embrace speed. Now, why speed? Think 1909. What is possible in 1909 that's a brand new thing that people didn't have available a generation before?
Airplanes.
Good. Cars, airplanes, boats that can actually move fast. I mean, all these ways of going fast, right? Suppose you are addicted to speed in, I don't know, I don't mean the drug speed. Let me rephrase that. Suppose you think it's wonderful to travel at high velocities in 1850. How do you go about it?
60 miles an hour.
Good. You can run. You can get on a horse and ride your horse fast, right? You can get on a train in 1850. In 1800, you can't even do that. But now, in 1909, yeah, you can drive a car, and a car can go a lot faster than a horse. You can actually take a ship that can move much faster than ships that moved before that time. You can get in an airplane even, and fly in an airplane. Now, in 1909, still kind of experimentally, but nevertheless, there were by this point, bi-wing aircraft. And so you could actually do this. There was a fascination with these new technologies that made it possible to travel very rapidly. And so here is Marinetti writing about this. He says, "Come, my friends, let us go. At last, mythology and the mystic cult of the ideal have been left behind. We're going to be present at the birth of the centaur. We shall soon see the first angels fly. We must break down the gates of life to test the bolts and the padlocks. Let's go. Here is the very first sunrise on earth. Nothing equals the splendor of its red sword, which strikes for the first time in our millennial darkness." So he sees himself at the outset of a brand new age where all sorts of things are possible. Now, we've talked about the loss of faith of the 19th century. We've talked about the loss of faith being intensified by the war. We've talked about the cynicism and some of the resulting attitudes. But what we haven't discussed very much is this attitude of excitement. Think about Nietzsche when he talks about there no longer being any absolutes. There's no longer really any up or down, any east or west, any right or left. Instead, it's up to us to set sail on this completely uncharted ocean. And Nietzsche sees how dangerous that is, but also how exciting it is. Marinetti is stressing the excitement. He says, we are at the foundations of a new world, a world that's going to be like nothing anybody's ever seen before. And he's thrilled about it. He realizes it's dangerous, but he loves the danger. He says, embrace the danger. It's going to be dangerous, but it's going to be exciting. And so he thinks of himself as like a hunter. And we hunted like young lions, decked with its black fur, dappled with pale crosses, who ran before us in the vast violet sky, palpable and living. Okay, so he's thrilled about this idea of the chase, of danger, of excitement, and death being the thing that makes it so exciting. Now, of course, he doesn't want to die. He wants to tame death. And so he says, death came went in front of me, in each corner, offering me his hand nicely, and sometimes lay on the ground with a noise of creaking jaws, giving me velvet glances from the bottom of puddles. The art you see here is actually his artwork that's meant to express this kind of futuristic idea. The future as viewed in 1909. dangerous, exciting, but thrilling, and giving the possibility of sort of new horizons. Well, there's also a theme here that will become more and more significant throughout the 20th century, and isn't tied to any specific political movement or ideology, but an awareness of the absurd. It is something that already he's writing about in 1909, but that becomes really intensified by the war and the senseless slaughter involved in the war. Let us leave good sense behind, he says, like a hideous husk, and let us hurl ourselves like fruit spiced with pride into the immense mouth and breast of the world. Actually, I've noticed it before, but that image makes no sense whatever. Anyway, let us feed the unknown, not from despair, but simply to enrich the unfathomable reservoir. I suppose that's why it makes it. I mean, I'm not supposed to care that it doesn't make any sense. Why are you supposed to be doing this? Well, it's absurd, right? There doesn't have to be a reason. So at some level, he's saying something that is quite radical. He's really saying, look, I'm not just saying that those elders of ours have been stodgy, and that I've lost faith in their particular ways of doing things. I've lost faith in logic. I've lost faith in reason. I've lost faith in, you name it. Sort of like the famous scene, what are you rebelling against? What do you got? Okay, it's sort of like that. We want new things. We're rebelling. Well, what? I mean, no, we're just embracing the absurd. It doesn't have to make sense. We don't care if it doesn't make sense. We want to sing of the love of danger, the habit of energy of rashness, courage, audacity, revolt. And so there's an intellectual movement already before the Russian Revolution and some of the other instances of violence that we have seen throughout this term and throughout this century that is already addicted to danger, to excitement, energy, novelty, whatever it brings, to being rash, to being bold, to revolt, whatever the consequences, all right? Don't bore me with the consequences. It's new, it's exciting, whatever is the idea. So, you might guess that that leads to a fondness for aggression. And indeed it does. Literature is up to now magnifying pensive immobility, ecstasy, and slumber. We want to exalt movements of aggression, feverish sleeplessness, the double march, the perilous leap, the slap, and the blow with the fist. Yeah.
Is he referring to the literature of his own country at this point?
I don't think he just means his own country. He's not just talking about Italian literature. He just means literature in general. What do writers write about? The birth of the novel occurred in probably, the 17th or 18th century. People disagree exactly about when it started, but sort of late 17th century, early 18th century. What would you say most novels of that period were about? I don't mean just the really oldest ones, but think of the 19th century. Charles Dickens. Think of other, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Somebody just says novels. I've never read a novel. Tell me what novels are like. How would you answer?
They're very introspective.
They're often very introspective, right? The novelist has room to, actually go into the background in a way that a playwright, for example, can't. In a play, action takes place, dialogue takes place. There aren't chapters where the people on stage just sit there while someone comes out and narrates and says, here's what she's really been thinking. Now, maybe that happens, but it's a pretty strange postmodernist play that does. Whereas in a novel, that's not at all uncommon to have the novelist, in effect, break in and say, here's what's been going on in the background, and so on. So it can be more introspective, it can give you more background, it can really paint an entire world in a way that you might say plays or poems can't quite do. What are some of the subject matters that these novels concern themselves with?
Are you talking about Charles Dickens specifically, or are you talking about old novels, or just
Yeah,
novels
sort
in
of
general?
novels before 1900.
Social morality, I guess,
Okay.
the way things were back in the day, and why that was wrong,
Well, okay, social morality, often, the way things were, why it was wrong, or, think Jane Austen, what are those books about? Social morality, definitely, but they're not really with Dickens' idea of social change, more like, I don't know, I've never made it through a Jane Austen book, I'm ashamed to say. I've really tried. But people just sit around and talk, and I get to about page 150, it's like, oh God, do something, just ask her out, whatever. But still, there's all this introspective dialogue, the social setting, and so forth, all of this stuff. Now, what is he saying? Well, it's really like, Yeah, it's pensive immobility. What a simple description of Jane Austen, pensive immobility, right? Lots of thinking going on, lots of chatting, not much action. Yeah, ecstasy, sometimes something, oh, somebody's really, really happy about this, and then blah, blah, blah. I mean, not a lot happens. He's saying, I don't want literature that's like that. I want literature of aggression, where you feel as if reading the novel is like getting a blow from a fist. Okay, that's what a good work of literature should do. It should slap you awake. It should punch you in the nose. It should wake you up. It should make you go somewhere. Okay? It should confront you with danger. That's what literature ought to do. It should shake you up. And so that's a very different conception of what literature and what art are supposed to do. Right? It's supposed to jolt you awake. It's supposed to smack you and say, wake up, man. Do something. Okay? That's the idea. Now, beauty, therefore, exists only in struggle. Every masterpiece is really aggressive in some way. It has an aggressive character. Poetry must be a violent assault on the forces of the unknown. Here you see a really nice image, by the way, of a little dog walking along. Roy will talk more about that. It glorifies war, and now we're getting close to where I really want to go with this. The futurists glorify war, the only cure for the world, they say. They glorify militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for woman.
Oh, women, not these.
No, contempt for women. We want to demolish museums and libraries, fight morality, feminism, and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice. Okay. I don't just love these guys. What's going on here? For one thing, why women? What do they have against women?
Passive men.
Well, they're not men. Good point, but I mean, beyond that.
They're very passive. They're not.
Women are passive.
Are they?
Yeah, well, there is a traditional image of women as passive, right? So are they objecting to women here or to the role that women...
To the traditional like role that they
Well,
what they
one
think
way
they
of reading
should
this is to say, yeah, we object to that role for women, okay? It's not that we have anything against individual women, but this idea of a passive role who has to be accepting... Yeah, that would be one way of rejecting this. But is there any other way in which we could take this? I mean, after all, they don't say contempt for the role, the traditional sex roles or anything like that. They say contempt for woman. Why? Yeah.
Could it maybe be that women normally, if a man finds a woman and like they love each other and everything, they kind of settle down and everything and make the man stop being crazy and glorifying war and stop being aggressive normally. They take away those.
Okay, good. There's this idea that is common at the time. Orson Welles later puts it this way, in a way that's somewhat more entertaining. He says, listen, if it weren't for women, we'd be still sitting around in caves eating raw meat. We made civilization to impress our girlfriends. Now, the idea there is that women are actually the agents of civilization. Why? Well, because it's when a man marries, for example, and starts a household, as you say, that he really settles down and falls into a certain pattern. Women are forces of stability, okay? Men are kind of crazy. They'll go out there and do all sorts of dangerous things. Women are forces of civilizing, of sort of preserving, of enriching culture. Notice women here are associated with museums, libraries, morality. Those are ordinarily thought to be good things, right? Good things that promote stability. So the futurist is saying, we don't want stability. We want constant change. We want violence. We want danger. Women get in the way of danger. I mean, suppose, all right, here I'm going to speak to the guys. Suppose you say, I want to do something wild and crazy. I want to go out, I want to get really drunk and jump off a cliff, okay, and see what happens. I want to do, don't worry, these guys, they've got some sheets they're going to bring along, and we're going to just grab the edges of the sheet and we're going to jump off. It'll be great. It'll be so cool. How many of you would say, oh yeah, I think I'll bring my girlfriend? or say, there's that cute girl in class, maybe I should ask her out, ask her if she wants to come and jump off the cliff with me. How many of you would do it, right? How many girls are going to sit around, I don't know, sorority sisters sit around and think, hey, let's get drunk and jump off a cliff. That's not going to happen, right? So in a way, I think the idea is supposed to be, look, women don't do these crazy, dangerous things. They don't fight wars. They aren't involved in all these violent criminal activities and so on, typically. They are agents of civilization, and so down with them all. right? Down with the museums and the libraries and the moral systems and women and anything else that sort of preserves stability in society. Now you might say, wait, that's a crazy view of men and women or whatever, but I think that's a view that many people at this time share. Yeah.
Why would anyone listen to this like craziness? I mean, just like in hindsight, this sounds like stupid. Like, why would anyone go, oh yeah, that's cool, let me just do that?
Right. That's a good question. We're going to confront that again and again, actually, in this course, where we read things and we say, this is crazy. Why does anybody believe this? Why does anybody get influenced by this? And it's a good question. Why do they? Yeah.
Just in response to that, like, I logically thought it was crazy, but emotionally I actually love this paper and agree with it. Like, I maybe that's weird, but
right.
I'm just saying.
Okay, there is something about this that is exciting, right? That's the first thing. I mean, you can be reading Jane Austen, or Friedrich Nietzsche, or Daniel Bonnebach, or whatever it is you're reading, and you know, there isn't much that excites you. There isn't much that calls you to action. There isn't much that's sort of like a bracing slap to the face. But this is. And so some people found it exciting. They found it exhilarating. He's saying, look, it's time to do something new. Do something exciting. And there were a lot of people who were kind of, frankly, tired of the situation as it stood, who said, yeah, all this is kind of boring, and now we've got these new technologies, and we can remake the world. That's a thrilling thing, a dangerous thing, yes. But by all means, let's remake it. And why contempt for woman? Because we know our wives and our girlfriends and our daughters and grandmas and so on will be saying, don't do anything crazy, but we want to do something crazy, okay? So I think to some extent this is an adolescent rebellion thing. And why does adolescent rebellion ever kind of seize people's imaginations? I'm too old to remember, but you guys probably understand better than I do. In a sense, it's that kind of expression of an idea of saying, yeah, it's up to us now, let's do something exciting and different. Well, here's one way in which something different really does get done. Lenin, born in 1870, died in 1924, which means he was only in charge of Russia for 7 years between the revolution in 1917 and 1924, actually for slightly less. But it happened very quickly. In April of 1917, in the midst of the First World War, the Germans allow Lenin passage to Russia to foment revolution. They have been having great success on the battlefield. On the other hand, they can't really succeed in driving Russia out of the war. They win at Tannenberg, at Lemberg, and the Manchurian Lakes, and so on. But why can't they just vanquish the Russian army? The Russians have a huge advantage over the Germans in a way that they cannot overcome. What is it?
Numbers?
Numbers. It's just a huge country and a huge army. So you kill 1 million Russian soldiers, 1 million more take their place. Okay? And I don't mean to put it too trivially. There was huge loss of life on the Eastern Front. That mattered a lot to Germany. It didn't matter a lot to Russia. They had a lot of people. And so the army was just much larger, and Russia, of course, was fighting on one front and not on two fronts as Germany was. So there was a huge advantage to the Russians in that respect. There was one other big advantage.
Ooh, yeah.
The weather, it's cold. And so for about half the year you couldn't fight at all. You were just trying to stay alive. Okay, and the Russians were much better equipped for that than the Germans were. So it was hard to break that through. The Germans think, here's another way to do it. We want Russia out of the war. We can win on the battlefield all we want, and it doesn't seem to actually lead to a decisive political victory that causes them to withdraw. What can we do? Let's undermine the government. It was already unstable. There had been a revolution in 1905. Let's send Lenin to Russia. He's been eager to go there. He's been in exile. Let him go back. See if he can plant the seeds of revolution. Now, who was Lenin? He was really a professional revolutionary. Paul Johnson, a historian, describes him this way. He was the first of a new species, a professional organizer of totalitarian politics. That was his job. He wasn't like Marx attaching himself to a rich patron in Engels. He didn't have a day job. He was a professional revolutionary. And he found support in enough groups that wanted revolution that he managed to live sort of through donations of people who essentially supported him as an organizer, somebody whose job was to organize revolution. And that's precisely what he did. Now, what will interest us is not only what he did, but how he changed Marxism in the process. He said he was an orthodox Marxist. From the philosophy of Marxism, he wrote, cast as one piece of steel, it is impossible to expunge a single basic premise, a single essential part without deviating from objective truth. So he's saying Marx had it right exactly, precisely in every single detail. Orthodox Marxism requires no revision of any kind. But in fact, he does revise it. And in what is to be done, and in his behavior, he makes it clear that he is changing things. How does the revolution come about in Marx? In Marx, we've got this whole history of class struggle. The bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, against the proletariat, the workers. Now, what changes it? How does the revolution ever occur? How do we abolish private property? How does the proletariat ever win out in Marx's story? What happens? The revolution happens, and how does it happen?
It comes from the bottom.
Everybody on there.
Working class.
It comes from the bottom up, right. At some point, the proletarians rise up and unite and cast off their chains, and then, boom, it happens. Okay, but it's not clear exactly how that's to take place. Somehow they're all supposed to realize their common interests, unite, and the revolution occurs. Now, in fact, does that tend to happen?
No.
Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a year of revolution. By 1917, how many countries had actually seen the proletarians rise up and take control?
None.
Zero, okay? It hadn't happened anywhere. So Lenin starts realizing, wait a minute, there is really, sotto voce now, there really is one flaw, and that is the proletarian revolution won't happen on its own. Marx, after all, was a determinist. He thought that social and economic forces determined everything. And so there was no role for the individual, no role for an individual will, for individual decision-making, for individual power. It was a question of the proletariat on one side, the bourgeoisie on the other side, right? These were large social forces, large classes. No individual really plays any significant role in the theory. There is, to look at it from one point of view, no place for human freedom, but also no place for human agency. Sort of like, okay, what if Marx is right? What does it mean for me? Well, it's not really clear what it means for you, right? What are you supposed to do about it? In fact, everything's determined by these big forces, by the class struggle. You're just one person. The implication is, actually, you don't have much to do with anything, and it's not just you, nobody does. But Lenin thought that was the flaw. He said, wait a minute, what Marx has said is not wrong, but he's leaving out something very important, which is the role of an individual person, the power of human freedom, the power of the will. He says, it is not true that we can analyze everything just in terms of classes. It may be right that there's a class struggle, that the proletarians are arranged against the bourgeoisie, but that doesn't mean no individual matters. Still, individual people make choices for individual reasons, and particular people can make a difference. And so, I think he views it not so much as something that Marx has exactly got wrong, as something that isn't yet filled in enough detail. He's painting on a very broad canvas, showing you how these large forces work and how these large classes work. Lenin says, yeah, but let's dial the microscope down more precisely. You'll see that individuals make a difference. And so, he argues for a kind of authoritarianism. He says classes aren't just these amorphous bodies, they are led by parties. And parties are led by individuals who are called leaders. That's in effect the part of Marx's picture that isn't there in Marx himself. It's not incompatible with it, Lenin would say, but those classes do what they do because they're led by people, and those individual leaders make a difference. This is ABC, he says. In other words, this is the basics. This is the foundational level. The classes do what they do because individual people are doing individual things. And so he says the will of a class is sometimes fulfilled by, notice he doesn't just say a leader, he says a dictator. Now, it's one thing to say classes, do what they do because individual people do what they do. That seems right? It's not like classes have any independent existence, they're groups of people. And so they do what they do because people are doing things. People often do things because they have leaders, and those leaders help direct the group. But now notice he doesn't just say some leaders matter. It's sometimes fulfilled by a dictator, by a single leader, by one person. Okay, so in What is to be Done, he talks about vanguard fighters. They are a revolutionary elite. This is a group of people who are going to bring about the revolution. This is the part, in effect, that he's saying Marx left out. It's the part that you have to dial in more carefully and see a finer grained picture to understand. How is the proletariat going to organize? Well, it's not going to organize itself. People are going to have to organize. And how does that happen? There has to be a small, secret, disciplined, revolutionary elite. They have to organize the proletariat. For one thing, they have to make most of the proletarians realize that they have to revolt. Now, in 1848, it was easy to look at people working 16-hour days in the factories and say, let's get them to revolt. They realize their situation is terrible, terrible. But in 1902 or 1909 or 1914 or 1917, what does the average worker think? It's not so bad. In fact, there's been this huge growth of affluence, right? So in 1848, wealth was highly centralized. There was tremendous inequality. Life in the cities for factory workers was often horrible. But by 1909, 1902, 1917, that's not true. The tremendous growth in affluence of the second part of the 19th century meant that the average working person now was working only 5 or maybe 5.5 days a week. Much shorter hours, still long by our standards, much shorter hours than they had been working a generation before. They had various kinds of toys, right? Mass production meant they could actually have some leisure time, they could have things to buy, they had disposable income. And so life seemed very different, much more pleasant to the average person. They're not going to revolt. Somebody has to convince them they need to revolt by making them aware of their oppression despite all of this. And that's what this elite has to do. Now, there were voices at the time who worried about this. A Marxist, Rosa Luxemburg, wrote that this would lead to a military ultra-century. In effect, she was with Lenin with the leader's part, but not about the dictator part, who said, wait a minute, it's one thing to try to create proletarian consciousness. Of course, a Marxist ought to do that. But now to do it by way of a small, secret, highly disciplined group to try to bring about a revolution through violence, she said, how does that ever reverse itself? You've got a small group of people who take control through violence. Now, yeah, imagine that you're part of the group. You and a few friends, sitting around one Friday night talking about philosophy, decide to take over the world. Just like Pinky in the Brain or something. By the way, did you realize I actually appear, my name appears in a Pinky in the Brain episode? Somebody discovered this last weekend. They were watching old episodes, and there's a list of one. Hillary Clinton comes up with a list of experts on the brain. She said, this is the page of leading experts on the brain. And my name is on the list. It's like, cool, it's like, awesome. I don't know anything about the brain, but hey, whatever. So, I was thrilled. Anyway, how I got there, I have no idea. But, suppose a few of you decide to take over the world, and you do it, right? Now what?
You have to tell everybody what to do.
Yeah, now you might think, okay, we've brought about the revolution, we can now bring about utopia. Do we give back this power? All power is now in a few people's hands, right? Do we disperse it and give it back? Now, few people in history have been in that position. They've been in a position to take complete power and they haven't done it. But it's a rare thing in world history. Who's done that?
George Washington.
George Washington, yes, was offered a kingship of America. He said, no, America should have no king, and so he insisted on a different form of government. He was offered, in effect, absolute power. He turned it down. Can you think of other cases like that? Caesar famously offered the crown 3 times, right, in the Lupercal, and Julius Caesar says, no, I don't want to be emperor. Okay, and shortly after that he was murdered because people were afraid that on the 4th time he would say yes. But he did say no 3 times, and there have been a few cases like that of people, often military leaders, as Caesar was and Washington was, who were offered absolute power and said no. But how many people will do it? So Luxemburg worried, look, you're in effect producing a military dictatorship. You're not talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, you're talking about the dictatorship of this secret disciplined elite. And that's not going to go anywhere good. But Lenin was convinced the revolution won't happen by itself. He says, the history of all the countries shows that the working class by its own effort is able to develop only trade union consciousness. What he means is this, get the working class to unite, and what do? They say, we demand higher wages. What are other things that trade unions do? Strike. But what do they demand?
Shorter hours.
Better hours.
Better hours, better working conditions, higher wages, right? They say, I want things to be better for me. And he says, okay, great, they can do that. But does that lead to revolution? No. Okay? The steelworkers say things should be better in the mills. And maybe they win and maybe they lose, but in any case, their concern is how things are in the steel mills. the teachers organize. Well, they're concerned with how things are in the schools, etc. None of it actually brings about large-scale social change. So, he says, you have to have an organization of revolutionaries, to bring about the revolution. And he says, these have to be people whose job is to be a revolutionary. Their job has to be an organizer, a professional revolutionary. Why? Why can't they be doing this on the side?
Because then they're biased towards one side.
Good. Both reasons are important. It's a full-time job, first of all. But the other thing is, that other side, they'll be too drawn to protecting it. If it's a professor who's a revolutionary on the side, he's going to be looking out for professors, okay? If it's a steel worker, he's going to be looking out for the steel workers. In short, he'll be tied to that trade union idea. And it's got to be somebody who's independent of all of that. And he says it's got to be not too extensive. You can't have too many people in it. Why?
If everyone's a leader, then there's no one to follow.
If everyone's a leader, there's no one to follow. There are other dangers too.
Becomes too dispersed, it pretty much becomes like a union again.
Good, too dispersed becomes like a union. It's also pretty hard to keep it secret, right? Hard to have a secret society that has 200,000 members. So, it's got to be small, it's got to be secret, it's got to have a stable organization of leaders. In other words, you can't just have the group gather once a year to elect a new chairman for the following year. It's got to be a highly stable group that maintains the same leadership, because this is something that will take years. And, he says, the more widely the masses are spontaneously drawn to the struggle and form the basis of the movement, the more necessary it is to have such an organization, the more stable it must be. Why? That sounds counterintuitive. He's saying, look, the more successful you become, the more people you attract to the cause, the more important it is to maintain that same leadership. Why? So there's not distrust, and so that the aims don't get dispersed, right? So that you can keep it going after the same goal instead of allowing that goal to be watered down. So you've got to have these people who pursue this as a profession. You've got to restrict the membership to people who are actively engaged in the revolution. And they've got to be highly trained. You've got to train them in the art of combating the political peace and all the police and all that. You've got to have people who are going to evade the attempts of other people to root out your organization. So this is going to be hard. You've got to be absolutely ruthless. He says to get rid of an unworthy member, you recoil from nothing. If somebody's not contributing in the right way, or if they're dispersing your goals, if they're leading you away from what you want, what should you do?
Kill them.
Whatever it takes, right. Kill them, torture them, it doesn't matter. The goal is the goal, okay? And you recoil from nothing. He laid out a step-by-step program for doing this. First goal, destroy all power outside the party. Okay, the Communist Party was to be the party that brought about this revolution. First of all, get rid of all the power outside the party. Make sure to concentrate political power in the hands of the party. Secondly, well, actually I said that already, all power in the hands of the party. Third, destroy all opposition within the party. Okay, the party has to be unified. It can't be something that has debates within it. This group has to be intensely committed to its goals. So you've got to, first of all, shrink power from the society to the party, then shrink the party's power to the revolutionary elite, and then shrink it to one leader. Len, yes?
Were these goals and that you had to do it in that specific order? I believe so. I'm just clarifying.
Not necessarily. He speaks of it in the text as if it's in this order, but actually I think all of those have to go at once. Because really, you start with the power of the group, very organized, very concentrated, and then what you have to do is get the whole political society to be like that. So that's going to have to take place in several steps, the order of which will be determined by how rapidly there is a desire to join this movement and so on. It may be that for a long time, it's just purely concentrated within this small group, but overall you don't really have any political power in society at large, and then you seize power. It might be that you start getting power by the growth of your party, and then you have to do something different. So I think the exact order will vary with events. But now, how do you do this? Well, close newspapers. They are sources of independent opinion. Close them or take them over. Have elections in every organization to give people the sense that they are contributing and participating. But in fact, of course, power will be carefully guarded. There will be house searches. You will confiscate fur coats. Now why?
Because that would distinguish like upper class people from lower class people, right?
First of all, it distinguishes the upper class from lower class, yes, so you confiscate the fur coats, but also we're talking about Russia. Come into Texas and confiscate our fur coats and, yeah, right, we can care less, right? It doesn't make any difference. Confiscate somebody's fur coat in Russia and it makes a difference. Seize schools, banks, factories. Establish revolutionary courts. And prohibit interest, dividends, and withdrawals. In other words, shut down banking so that people can't get at any of the wealth they actually have.
When you say the elections in every organization, wouldn't women be the one to pick?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Why elections everywhere? Why not just have Lenin handpick people?
So that it seems like everybody's involved.
Good. First advantage is it seems like everybody's involved. But there's a second advantage. Suppose somebody screws up. Right? If it's Lenin's appointee, they can blame Lenin. If it's somebody you guys elected, man, he screwed up. Picked the wrong person, right? So it allows him to remain above the fray and not actually get into trouble by anything that goes wrong. He's also committed to the use of terror. He says, we've never renounced terror and cannot renounce it. We'll ask the man, where do you stand on the question of the revolution? Are you for it or against it? If he's against it, we'll stand him up against the wall. Now this, in fact, in the Red Terror gets applied widely throughout Russian society. People are confronted with that. Where do you stand on the question of the revolution? If you're against it, you're executed. It doesn't matter what walk of life you're in or anything else. Although walk of life does matter, as we'll see. The secret police was not officially acknowledged for 10 years, but within 3 years it had 250,000 full-time leaders. You see here piled up in a prison camp bodies of people who were executed by the secret police. They were called the Cheka. And the Cheka operated secretly but massively throughout Russia, eliminating enemies of the revolution. By 1918, so just a few months after Lenin seized power in November of 1917, they were averaging 1,000 executions a month for political crimes. Here you see some of the bodies. People were arrested, tried, sentenced, and punished very, very quickly. There were no checks on power at all. There were no due process guarantees, nothing of the sort. You were arrested, tried before the party, sentenced and shot within a very short period of time. You had no opportunity, in many cases, to mount a defense or even confront the real charges against you. Within weeks of November 1917, the party was operating a system of concentration and labor camps. By 1920, there were over 50,000 executions a year being carried out. He said the goal was to seek out, arrest, and shoot immediately. And now notice a wide group of people: enemies, idlers, bribe takers, speculators, prostitutes, ex-officers, work shirkers, hoarders, etc. Not a minute to be wasted. Notice there were many ways of getting to be an enemy of the regime. Wait, you kept an extra sandwich for yourself? Boom. Wait, you didn't show up for work on time? Boom. You were a lieutenant in the Russian army during the war? Boom. Why shoot all the officers?
So there's no other people that have leaders?
Exactly, they were the leaders, right? They were people who were trained to be leaders. You don't want competition. And the ideology of this was collective guilt. This was Latsis, also known as Peters, the leader of the Cheka. Without mercy, and without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let there be thousands, let them drown themselves in their own blood. Let there be floods of the blood of the bourgeois. Here's what makes a difference: whether people are of the right class. Solzhenitsyn listed some of the targets: homeowners, high school teachers, priests, monks, nuns, pacifists, trade union officials were all to be executed, simply because of the position. Lenin described this as purging the land of all kinds of harmful insects. Our revolutionary courts, he said, must shoot. Well, we're out of time, but I could go on and on for quite a while about this. Next time, we will turn toward, I hope, less bloody reactions to world war.